So this talk is focused on, in a way, the core theme of the Pastoralism project, and asks the very basic question, what is uncertainty? And through the talk I'm going to explore a number of different approaches from different literatures, different disciplines. And the talk is linked to an accompanying paper which tries to do this and offers some reflections on that literature as a review. It's a vast literature and I can't possibly do justice to it in a very short talk, and indeed the longer paper doesn't do justice to it. So it's quite a personal take and a reflection of it through my own understandings of what might be interesting and useful, particularly as we think about relating the questions of uncertainty to pastoralism. So, uncertainty as a theme. In this series of talks we've discussed this already, but it does seem to be an acceptance more broadly that uncertainty is a key topic of our times. Helga Novotny, in her book The Cunning of Uncertainty, argues that uncertainty is indeed written into the script of life. Many years before, Mary Douglas, a social anthropologist with a big and deep interest in risk, argued that unwrapping the gifts we receive from randomness, thriving on the cusp of uncertainty, and knowing when is the right moment to act, delay, or forego action are different ways of embracing uncertainty. But how do we understand it, and why does it matter? Are our societies today equipped to respond to uncertainties, different types of accelerating uncertainties across the world? And for the Pastoralism project, we can ask, and do ask, can we learn from those who have lived with, from, and off uncertainty for generations and feed this into this wider debate? So, what is uncertainty? There's rather dominating in the literature a quite conventional, managerial, one could say technocratic, control-orientated approach to uncertainty, which actually demotes it and defines it in relation to risk. But actually, when future outcomes are not known, and when there are disputes about what outcomes are desired amongst different groups of people, then really an indeterminacy prevails in what often are complex, interconnected systems. Then risk approaches, control-orientated approaches, fail, and assumptions that they might work are, I would argue, potentially dangerous. So in this much wider and I think much more common situation, the condition of uncertainty, or more broadly incertitude, a rather greater humility is required and different conceptual methodological approaches needed. Now, I think this has huge implications for the practices of science, of management, of policy, of administration, and consequences for how we think about institutions and the governance arrangements. This is relevant in pastoral settings, but it's relevant elsewhere, I'd argue. A narrow, linear, modernist view of progress is challenged through this, and it opens up new questions about how we navigate the world under conditions of uncertainty. Yet, statecraft, the institutions that exist out there, are all about particular styles of power and control, and the elimination of uncertainty through a risk framing is very dominant. We see this in the very notion of what the state is emerging from the practices and deployment of statistics. And we see it in the arguments of James Scott and others about seeing like a state, or Tanya Lee, the will to improve. Development very much is often constructed in and around control and order, often not encompassing uncertainty. However, in big fields of intellectual inquiry, take science and economics, there's been a long-running debate about the importance of taking uncertainty seriously. So, quoting from Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he can capture the ambitions of science and its relationship to uncertainty, I think, really well. And I quote, "It is imperative in science to doubt. It is absolutely necessary for the progress of science to have uncertainty as a fundamental part of your inner nature. To make progress in understanding, we must remain modest and allow that we do not know. Nothing is certain or proved beyond all doubt. You investigate for curiosity because it is unknown, not because you know the answer." And I think many scientists would accept thoroughly that that's very much part and parcel of science, yet the practice of science and scientific related policy and institutions very often close that perspective off. In economics, of course, there's a long tradition going way back to the classical economists who recognized uncertainty very fundamentally. And it was in the 1920s when Frank Knight, in particular, created within economics that formal differentiation between risk and uncertainty. Risk when you know or can at least develop forms of prediction, and uncertainty when you don't know. Yet, in both science and economics, key inputs to thinking about policy in pastoralism and other domains, these perspectives on uncertainty are often squeezed out or ignored. There's been, over time, I think, a disciplinary and methodological narrowing of perspectives. That means that neoclassical economics, normal statistics often push out uncertainty, close down to risk, forget indeterminacy, ignore complexity. Kenneth Arrow, reflecting back on his career as an economist over many decades, argued in the early 90s that vast ills have followed a belief in certainty. When developing policy, caution is always needed because we cannot predict the consequences. So many people have argued that uncertainty is central, yet institutions, policies, and so on tend to exclude perspectives on uncertainty. But how do we understand uncertainty? This is a simple 2x2 diagram developed by Andy Sterling, a colleague in the STEP Centre many years ago, and we found it, and I found it, incredibly useful as a very simple way of thinking about uncertainty across, or more broadly, as Andy calls it, incertitude, across 4 different dimensions. Dimensions differentiated by knowledge about the likelihoods of what's going to happen and knowledge about what will happen, the outcomes. So, take some examples from, in this case, northern Kenya, Isiolo. Again, when we know what the likelihoods are and we know about the outcomes, for example, in building a road, risk approaches can be quite useful. We can use models, we can use engineering approaches, and the standard engineering risk approach can be quite useful. However, under conditions when we don't know the likelihoods, we know the outcome, drought will kill animals, but we don't necessarily know the likelihoods, then we're in the domain of uncertainty. We can reduce it to risk through modelling, but we don't necessarily know exactly when that drought event is going to come. And even with all the expansion of climate modelling and so on, that remains the case. There's a different dimension of incertitude where we might know the likelihoods of something happening, but we don't necessarily know, or there is a debate between different groups of people about the outcomes. That's what Andy calls ambiguity. And here's an example that we looked at in an earlier talk, where, for example, in Isiolo, there might be 3 different debates about what the outcomes of a particular development project might be. For example, one could think about pastoralism, extensive pastoralism. One could think about wildlife conservation and conservation areas. one could think about infrastructure development, developing airports, roads, and so on. Each of these are possible outcomes. We know the likelihoods of each and the potential consequences of each, but there is a debate about them. There's an ambiguity. The final domain of incertitude is when we don't know the outcomes and we don't know the likelihoods, when we don't know what we don't know. And that actually is probably the most common form of incertitude, where actually there is contests on all fronts. So what happens when we have these four dimensions and think about them in relation to politics, power, and so on? Here's a diagram that looks at the operation of different techniques and practices and the wider phenomenon that we see again and again in different settings of what one might call closing down to risk, where even if it's a bit tentative, we end up saying, well, we can at least predict outcomes and we can predict the likelihoods of them happening. And this happens through a variety of practices and techniques. The use of modelling, processes of financialisation, planning, the seeing like a state phenomenon that we've discussed before, all reinforced by particular professions, disciplines, styles of policy making. In the literature, it's referred to as variously as the audit culture, the risk management of everything, Mike Power's books, for example, on that, or following a Foucauldian approach, forms of governmentality that push us to a risk framing away from ignorance, away from uncertainty, away from addressing ambiguity. So very often that's the pattern we see, closing down to risk. But how do we open up and broaden out and encourage an embracing of an uncertainty? Now I want to touch on 5 different ways of thinking about uncertainty from different areas of the literature. It's, as I mentioned before, a huge and very diffuse and diverse literature coming from different disciplines. But there has been, certainly over the last 30, 40 years, an explosion of literature on risk in particular, and debates about uncertainty that go on within that. It's difficult to put a point on where this started. I mentioned earlier literatures from classical economists, Knight and so on. But there was a paper that linked risk and policy very firmly in 1969 by Chauncey Starr, which for many see that as the start of, as it were, a literature and a debate on risk management. And this, of course, rose out of a rising concern in the West, particularly of the consequences of new technologies, new investments and so on, nuclear power, environmental pollution, the consequences of that, and the need to balance technological progress with societal and environmental needs. And the answer was risk management, risk assessment, risk management, risk communication, and it blossomed into a huge area both of literature but also of policy around the world. Now I want to go into some of the debates that are linked to that more policy-orientated debate and dig a bit deeper to think about, well, how is uncertainty and risk thought about across these literatures? And I've divided them slightly arbitrarily into 5 here. They overlap, of course, as we'll see. The first category I want to highlight is what might be called societal perspectives, coming out particularly of sociology, and particularly European sociology, in the 80s and 90s. And the key book here is Ulrich Beck's book, The Risk Society, published originally in German in 1986, published later in English in 1992. And it was a a particular moment and reaction in his case to the Chernobyl disaster. And he argued, and he argued many things, and his arguments changed over time, but in the Risk Society he distinguished traditional society, industrial society, and risk society. And he argued that risk society emerges particularly as the unintended consequences of modernity, environmental risks and so on, which conventional institutions of industrial society can't address. There is this shift, a shift in political focus where risks in particular, and the distribution of risks as bads in society, means that class, which was a conventional way up to that point in the 70s, the rise of Marxist analysis, becomes less salient as an analytical category. And instead, through a process of what he calls public reflection and the emergence of new subpolitics, a new reflexive modernization emerges in the risk society, driven by individuals and groups within that society concerned with environmental and other risks. That's a very brief summary of a complex argument which he extended in the World Risk Society. Niklas Luhmann came, another German sociologist, with another angle on the similar debate. And it's a huge literature which continues to be debated today, even after Beck's death. Some of those debates include issues relevant to the Pastoralism project, for example. People have raised the question of whether this was a very narrow interpretation based on a particular moment in European history and European concerns, Northern European concerns indeed, and whether this applied to other cultural, historical and socio-economic contexts. I think there's an important element, important justification to that argument. Was the emergence of, as it were, the argument for a risk society very conditioned by a particular set of events, such as Chernobyl, cultures and institutional experiences that emerged in European context and perhaps US context? Or is it more generalizable, as Beck tried to do, to a distinct period in world history? Is there really such a rupture from class dynamics as is suggested in the Risk Society? The Risk Society, in a classic big picture theorization of society, obviously comes up with some big generalizations, but actually isn't class, gender, age, other forms of social difference still relevant, not just your risk position in society? Even if risks are manufactured, emergent out of a particular societal context, as Beck argues, surely the natural world is still important. I think it is, of course. So we could go on with the critiques. There's a whole library full of debate about Beck and so on. But I think, the braveness of that intervention was important because it said, look, aren't we living in a new, turbulent, complex time where uncertainty and risk are central? Does this not require a rather more fundamental rethinking of society? And I think that was a useful contribution, useful provocation. And many others have done the same. Zygmunt Bauman, I think, is interesting for our reflections on pastoralism. He argues in his book Liquid Times that the certainties of previous times no longer apply today, that nomadism, the word he uses, is a trait of liquid modern humans. Now, whether you like the language and the sort of complexity of his arguments or not, I think he's got an important point. that actually today flows between occupations, identities and networks. Life is shifting, mobile, provisional, improvised, rather than structured, sedentary, fixed and static, resonates very strongly with perspectives in pastoralism. And what Bauman is talking about, again, is our European Western context, where ruptures in society are creating the need to think about uncertainty much more thoroughly. So in Pastres, we want to ask, are the deeply embedded characteristics of thought, practice, social organization that facilitate responses to variability and complexity and turbulence? And how are these represented in societal networks, relations, moral economies, practices of mobility, and so on? So engagement with these literatures, I think, can be useful. Now, overlapping, of course, are the variety of different political perspectives on uncertainty and risk that are central to the debates that I've mentioned. There was a book in the late 90s by a guy called Bernstein, 1998, I think, called Against the Gods, and he was arguing from a very neoliberal stance that uncertainty in a way makes us free. It liberates individuals and entrepreneurs from the shackles of the state, and highlighted an individual neoliberal vision of individual freedoms associated with an acceptance of uncertainty and a centrality of risk. Well, that's one particular political position which I don't subscribe to, but it was highly influential, very popular book. Others, though, focus much more on thinking about the relationship between risk management and control, which I think is much more pertinent. And in the now famous book, The Studies of Studies in Governmentality, drawing on Michel Foucault, there's some nice chapters in there that reflect on different risk practices and their political effects. Foucault, as you may know, talks about governmentality as the conduct of conduct, the way techniques of government are deployed to produce governable subjects. And I think that's an important reflection on how we think about risk, whether that's insurance, whether that's modelling, whether that's the practices of intervention around social protection. There are forms of governmentality that are played out there, what Foucault would call biopolitics. Reflecting on that debate that was generated by Ulrich Beck, what about class and social difference? Does risk uncertainty make class analysis redundant? I think not. But it also pushes us to think a little bit more laterally about how classic class analyses might work under conditions of uncertainty. And this is a theme we'll pick up later in a later talk when we think about critical agrarian economy, political economy. Finally, in the literatures on politics, I think there's a very strong and more contemporary strand of work that is in the field of political ecology more broadly. The image in this slide is of a recent handbook in political ecology, and since the 80s there's been a big flourishing of debates in what's been defined political ecology. I mean, it's a broad church, it must be said, but one of the strong themes within that literature is a critique of defining external hazards as natural. To understand how risks and uncertainties that impinge on people are, in that sense, manufactured, are related to political, societal, social contexts. And we have to, if we're to understand vulnerability, we have to understand those contexts which are circumscribed by historical political economy, but also race, gender, age, location, occupation, and so on, raising questions of environmental and social justice in relation to questions of risk and uncertainty. So risk and uncertainty can't just be managed as if it's separate out there as part of an external natural hazard. It's very much part and parcel of a social and political question. And that, I think, is going to be crucial for us in thinking through questions within pastoralism. How social difference affects people's ability to respond to uncertainty through what might be called an intersectional approach. We can equally explore how external interventions, as I say, insurance, social protection, land tenure interventions, market interventions, whatever in pastoral areas, are forms of biopolitics and governmentality, and how they intersect with this, what politics are created by those interventions, how uncertainties are recast through that. Moving on, and as I said, all of these are related, we can see a big strand in the literature which can be called cultural perspectives of different sorts. Mary Douglas, who I mentioned earlier, is probably the most celebrated anthropologist who linked risk to cultural perspectives. From her classic books on purity and danger, risk and culture with Wildavsky, and many more. And she became associated over time with what I think personally is rather deterministic and functionalist schema that contrasted grids and groups in different ways. She and others in what became called cultural theory tried to, as it were, develop a sense that there were archetypal cultural forms that meant people responded to risk and uncertainty in different ways. And there are various ways that this is characterized in the literature, but there's usually 4 groups along 2 axes, contrasting people and groups who are people in society, cultures that are more group orientated, more associated with social bonding, versus those who are more individualist, more stratified. And 4 different groups come out of this analysis: individualists, fatalists, hierarchists, and egalitarians, each supposedly defining a culturally embedded form of behaviour in relation to risk and uncertainty. So I'm presenting this not because I agree with it, but because it's a big strand in the literature, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and many continue to advocate this as a useful way of thinking. Others, social anthropologists, are less functionalist and have a less sort of simple model to explain the importance of culture and social relationships in thinking about risk and uncertainty. A lot of nice ethnographies have sort of dug into where do people talk about risk and uncertainty in the future? Where are the sites of exchange? How does gossip, how does rumour, how do different cultural modes of thinking affect how we think about how different people think about uncertainty? And I think those are nice because they get us away from sort of standard ways of thinking about risk and uncertainty in policy domains, to think about how, on a day-to-day basis, people negotiate that amongst themselves, within families, within groups, and so on. Where that happens, what forms of sociality are associated with this. There's obviously a large strand of work on sort of so-called lay or indigenous knowledges that help us think about that there are multiple knowledges that help us think about the future. It's not just from, as it were, evidence-based science. There are different ways of thinking about predictions and how those are negotiated. And there's a wonderful book chapter and paper by Brian Wynne that explores this in relation to sheep farmers in Cumbria in the UK, in the post-Chernobyl area, where he argues that the sort of conflicts between science-based regulation and advice and local understandings was very, very much central to that. Of course, religions as part of cultures have important perspectives on futures and risks, how the world is governed in relation to moral orders, notions of fate, divinity, impermanence, are all ways of refracting our understandings of risk and uncertainty. And through that, we can often have different definitions of risk and uncertainty that are not necessarily about potential disaster and potential bads, as often portrayed in the standard risk literature. Risks and uncertainties may offer hope. They may offer possibilities of action. They may offer different ways of thinking about the future, in different ways of thinking about the future in relation to non-linear time, Western notions of time and portrayals of the future can be quite particular, but there are other cultural ways of thinking about the future that are associated with different notions of time. And I think that literature is important and interesting when we think about that. And of course, related to that is how do people emotionally think about uncertainty and risk and the future, very much embedded in their effective responses to uncertainty. So I think these cultural perspectives, or at least those coming out as sort of ethnographic, social anthropological engagement, can be very useful for us in the Pastoralist project, and how we think about how pastoralist knowledges and cultural practices respond to uncertainties. Not just in terms of, as it were, their management responses, say, in relation to mobility, but how they feel about that, how they think about that in relation to religious, moral perspectives. And we can explore uncertainty and variability and instability and unpredictability and all these terms that exist in the English language associated with a particular policy literature, in people's own language, in people's own culture, in people's own religious and emotional affective practices. And I think that will be very revealing for how we think about uncertainty overall. So moving on, practice-based perspectives, obviously linked to cultural perspectives, but very much focus on what people do on a day-to-day basis. And there's a lot of literature out there on this, coming from everything from sort of public administration and a focus on everyday practices. Albert Hirschman is a big hero on this front, again writing way back in the 1970s, through to others who work in organizational theory, to Emery Rowe and colleagues working on reliability and mess, through to more theoretical perspectives coming out of anthropology and sociology from practice theory and so on. So there's again a big literature which may not easily be combined, but have different perspectives on the importance of practice, the everyday, what people do. And what people do can also be about how politics are constructed. So this relates across these theoretical domains. How politics are constructed, how markets are made, how the economy is manufactured as an idea, and how models, maps, particular what are called calculative practices, drawing on, again, Foucault, are deployed in creating either risk or uncertainty, or the way that we manage and navigate these. So I think when we think about this in relation to our studies of pastoralism, studies in science and technology studies, for example, can be very helpful in thinking about how markets are created. the work of Donald Mackenzie and colleagues, and many other colleagues, is very useful in that regard. We'll come to the work of Emery Rowe and colleagues on reliability management and reliability professionals in the next session. Because again, I think a focus on what people do and how people manage and navigate uncertainty is a really crucial area. And then the wider theory around social practice and practice theory focuses on issues of performativity, improvisation, experimentation, and so on. And the role of agency as embedded in networks becomes crucial. So in the Pastoralist project, whether we're thinking about implementation of projects, of the constructions of risk, markets, and so on, we can think about these issues and the role of practice in different ways. So finally, there are a whole set of literatures that focus on individuals as social beings, but also individuals' psychologies. And the so-called psychometric paradigm in psychology has been very influential in thinking about risk. Gaming exercises, gambling games, and psychological tests have been very, very much part and parcel of this. And very often these type of tests end up identifying whether people have particular psychological attributes, whether they dread, whether they blame, whether they take a safety first attitude. So all of these are very much part and parcel of that, what has been called the psychometric paradigm, which is a vast literature, very often based on the assumption that it's individuals who navigate risk and uncertainty. And that individual perspective can be quite problematic because it often ends up in policy with this perspective of what's been called the deficit model. The problem out there is people are not just following the advice. There's a deficit. And that is a problem of individuals who need education and need to be educated into being better at managing risk. So that individualist approach comes from a tradition of largely, exclusively Western psychology that results and focuses on individual anticipation, personal resilience, perseverance, tolerance, and so on. Now, I don't want to reject it out of hand, but I think it's quite problematic, and there's debates in psychology, of course, that demonstrates that individualist approach is problematic because individuals, of course, and humans, of course, are social beings. But often this is taken to another extreme by engagement with neurobiology. There's a whole literature out there on neurobiology, which I have to say I haven't read huge amounts of, but have come across, which tries to link uncertainty and risk behaviours to areas of the brain and brain functioning. So a very reductionist approach to understanding risk and uncertainty. But it's out there, it's part of the literature, and I wanted to be reasonably comprehensive. But I don't think even when we get to that point that these approaches are going to be that useful for us, because risk and uncertainty responses are not really reducible, certainly to brain function, let alone to individualized characteristics of psychology. So we want to, I think, develop a much more socially and institutionally embedded approach and ask, indeed, whether these individualist Western psychology approaches can really help in pastoral settings. And ask and extend that, how do people in families, communities, wider networks negotiate risk? How does this affect people's livelihoods? So, to conclude, what are the alternatives to all of these risk framings and thinking about risk as a debate about probabilities of likelihoods and probabilities of outcomes? I think there are a lot of debates out there that are peripheral but impinge on the uncertainty literature. And in reading this literature broadly, I think there are some quite interesting themes that are emergent out of debates that we're having already in thinking about pastoralism. This is on the left there is a picture of the paper by Saverio Cratterley and Nicholas Jarieka, which emphasize living off uncertainty, the type of practices and cultures that pastoralists pursue to live from uncertainty and use uncertainty as a resource. As I say, a lot of the risk literature is about preventing harm, disasters, risks to human life, environmental catastrophes and the rest. But if we think about uncertainty as a resource, we can flip it a bit and think about how uncertainty as a resource, which is not going to go away, and variability in pastoral environments is not going to disappear, but to think about it as a resource where hope, possibility, action can emerge. And I think there's some nice material out there that does that. There's a lovely book by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark, which is a piece of literature more than a policy analysis. And she argues, and I'll quote a little bit from her book here, when you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes. You alone, or you in concert with a few dozen or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and knowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. So she argues very strongly that actually uncertainty and embracing that is a positive force and can lead to action. Arguments made equally in books about perspectives on care, and older books. One of my favourite old books from the early 1970s, Ivan Illich argued similarly about the notion of conviviality emerging out of these type of conditions. So, I mean, I don't want to stretch the argument too far, but I want to make the case that actually when we think about uncertainty, and particularly in pastoral settings, we also have to think about it in these broader terms. So, to conclude, which way? Uncertainty. Uncertainty as a resource, as a fuel for possibility and hope, uncertainty as a risk that can close down. Different framings of what we think about can have quite different effects. And this is a theme that I want to pursue more substantially in the next talk that will follow this.